The Biblical Times Podcast. Writer and editor, Dr. Leora Ravid. Narration, David Green. Episode 9. Pictures from Rachel and Leah's married life. Genesis 29-30. Hello to all listeners of the Biblical Times Podcast. This is the second and final episode which we are dedicating to the story of Jacob and his two wives, Rachel and Leah. If we had the time, we could add more episodes to the story of the three, and maybe we will do it in the future. We ended the previous episode by saying that the story of Jacob's marriage can be read from two different perspectives, historical and theological. Because of the defect in Leah's eyes, she was supposed to get married as a concubine, which is inferior to that of a senior wife, whose father received a bride price for her, or in return, a bride for one of his sons. Had Leah married as a concubine, then Rachel would have been the only senior wife of Jacob. And since the status of the mother determines the status of her sons, in this case, the status of Leah's sons would have been lower than that of the sons born to her sister, even though they were born first. However, from the theological point of view, Leah's malformation was of no importance. God chose her to be the foremother of David, the greatest king of Israel, who was born to the tribe of Judah. The tribe of Judah was named after Leah's fourth son. Furthermore, according to the tradition in Exodus 28, the families of the priests in Israel came from the tribe of Levi, named after her third son. Now that we have briefly mentioned what we talked about in the previous episode, we can move on. The purpose of this episode is to provide our listeners with a rare glimpse into Rachel and Leah's married life. This is indeed a rare glimpse because in principle, the Bible does not tell almost anything about the married lives of the heroes it describes. A minimal deviation from this practice exists only in rare cases, and even then, in most cases not directly, but through puns. Before we go any further, it is important to explain the role played by puns, as this phenomenon repeats itself hundreds of times in the Bible. Nowadays, puns are mainly tools that stand-up comedians use to entertain their viewers. It is so nowadays, but not in the Bible. In the 5th episode of our podcast, we explained why the stories in the Bible are so short and why every word that could have been spared was spared. We said that one of the reasons for this was that the Bible was written on leather, which was an extremely expensive material and required great skill to prepare it for writing. We also said that the preparation of the special ink used for writing was also expensive. Perhaps this explains why the stories in the Bible are so short. Such economical writing required the writers of the Bible to develop an extraordinary writing technique by which they multiplied and even tripled the meaning of the same story without adding even a single word. We already gave an excellent example of this phenomenon in the previous episode when we showed that the same number of words were used to write a story that can be read from two different perspectives, historical and theological. Another method of expanding the story was the intensive use of words with multiple meanings. Unfortunately, different meanings of the same word cannot be translated from one language to another, especially when it comes to a holy book, which has been translated literally. In this case, the translator had to choose one specific meaning and give up others. A wonderful example of this limitation was also given in the previous episode when we translated the meanings of the names of Rebecca, Leah, and Rachel, who are among the most familiar names in the Western world. Rebecca in Hebrew is a fat heifer. Rachel is a sheep. The name Leah was taken from an ancient language called Akkadian. Leah in Akkadian is a cow. Since the three women were born on a thriving sheep farm, they were named after milk-producing animals. We will use this opportunity to give another excellent and surprising example that illustrates how, thanks to puns, a short text turns into a much longer one without adding a single written word to it. The example also illustrates the limitation of literal translation from one language to another. Everyone knows that the name of the first man created by God was Adam, which is of course incorrect. In Hebrew, the word Adam has two different meanings, both of which play a key role in the creation story. The first meaning of Adam is man or male. Let's read a very brief quote from the book of Genesis. "And God said, 'Let us make man,' meaning Adam, in our image. So God created male and female." In other words, the first man was named after the species to which he belonged. The second meaning of the word Adam is namely ground or dust. Quote, And the Lord God formed man, Adam, of the dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. At the time of the last farewell, it is customary to say, "By the sweat of your brow you will eat your food until you return to the ground, since from it you were taken. For dust you are, and to dust you will return." So, while we refer to the name Adam just as another meaningless name, in the Bible this name denotes the gender and substance from which the first man was made. The peak of genius for using puns that cannot be translated literally is reserved for the author who wrote the story about Jacob's family. Through puns, he hid a second story within the familiar one, which is completely different from it. For convenience, let us start by interpreting the easy names that take part in the story and gradually move on to the more complex names. Jacob in Hebrew is Yaakov. This name is derived from the root akev, which has two different meanings. The first one is to follow someone. The second is heel. Jacob, who was born after Esau, was born holding his heel. Quote, "After this, his brother came out with his hand grasping Esau's heel, so he was named Jacob, Yaakov." When we understand that Jacob's name means to follow someone and heel, it is quite clear that he was the young twin. This fact explains why the birthright status was intended for Esau, whose name has no meaning. Leah and Rachel's father was named Laban, which means white. White symbolizes virtue and cleanliness. Over the years, Laban was severely criticized for deceiving Jacob and marrying him to Leah instead of the girl he loved. But as we showed in the previous episode, God chose Leah to be the ancient mother of the line of kings and priests in Israel. Therefore, on the night Laban married Leah to Jacob, he fulfilled God's mission, and so there is no doubt that his name suited him. Now we come to the climax of our episode, which is the interpretation of the names of the 12 sons born to Jacob, revealing 12 stages of Leah and Rachel's married life. According to the Bible, Leah gave the names of the boys she and her slave, Zilpah, gave birth to. Since the slave belonged to her mistress, the children she gave birth to belonged to the mistress. Rachel did the same and gave the names of the sons born to her and her slave, Bilhah. First, we will follow the interpretations Leah gave to her sons. Through them, we will listen to the voice of a suffering woman whose husband took his revenge on her shoulders because she was fraudulently given to him. Despite his hatred, Jacob did not refrain from Leah, and she became pregnant and bore him an eldest son. Quote, "And Leah conceived and bare a son, and she called his name Reuben, for she said, because the Lord has looked upon my affliction. Surely now my husband will love me." The birth of a healthy son is a joyous event in any family, but in a world where infants and children mortality rates were so high, any pregnancy that began and ended successfully was considered God's grace. Indeed, there are dozens of names that express the parents' gratitude to God. Ishmael is interpreted as God heard. Joshua, Isaiah, and Hosea have the same interpretation, meaning God's salvation. The original name of Jesus, who was born, lived, and died in Israel, was Yoshua, also meaning salvation. Considering this custom, we would expect Leah to be grateful to God for bestowing her an eldest son. But Leah did not thank God. In a voice crushed with pain, she perpetuated on Reuben's behalf the hostile treatment she received from her husband and her longing for a little affection that he showered on her sister. Leah's plea for some affection went unanswered, and Jacob continued to humiliate and scorn her even after she bore him a second son, Simon, or Shimon in Hebrew. Shimon means to hear, and God indeed heard Leah. Quote, "And she conceived again, and bare a son, and said, because the Lord has heard that I am hated, he has given me this son also. And she called his name Simon, or Shimon in Hebrew." Once again, the Lord heard Leah's cry, and granted her a third son, Levi. And she conceived again, and bare a son, and said, now this time my husband will be joined to me, because I have borne him 3 sons. Therefore his name was called Levi. Levi means joining or a companion. This is the exact translation of now my husband will join me. But still, even after her third birth, Leah did not thank God. Nevertheless, Levi's name reveals a modest change for the better in Leah's feelings. Fertile Leah conceived a fourth time and gave birth to Judah, or Yehuda, meaning thanks to God. And she conceived again and bare a son, and she said, Now will I praise the Lord. Therefore she called his name Judah. In Judah's name, the dramatic change that began in Leah's life becomes explicit. Her request for some affection was finally granted, and she found the strength to lift her head and thank God for his great kindness. According to the order of events, the spotlight now passes to Rachel's tent, but we will continue to follow the joyful changes that took place in the courtyard of Leah. The next two sons born in her growing camp were born to her slave woman Zilpah. As we said before, because the sons of a slave belonged to her mistress, Leah gave them their names and interpreted their meanings. And Zilpah, Leah's maid, bore Jacob a son. And Leah said, What good fortune! So she named him Gad. Gad means luck, or as Leah said, good fortune. At this stage, Leah had given Jacob 5 sons, and indeed, she was a lucky woman. And when her slave bore a second son, Leah's happiness surpassed all bounds. Quote, And Zilpah, Leah's maid, bore Jacob a second son. And Leah said, Happy am I, and she called his name Asher. Asher means joy or great happiness. And to increase her joy, God gave her 3 more children. The first on was Issachar, meaning rewarded or wages. Quote, And God listened to Leah, and she became pregnant and bore Jacob a 5th son. Then Leah said, God has rewarded me for giving my servant to my husband. So she named him Issachar. Then Leah conceived again and bore Jacob a son for the 6th time. Leah said, God has endowed me with a good endowment. Now my husband will dwell with me, for I have borne him 6 sons. So she called his name Zebulun. The term Zebul means temple or a palace. After Leah gave birth to 6 boys, she had every reason to feel like a queen living in her palace, or Her Zebul. Finally, she gave birth to a girl, Dinah, whose name she did not explain. Beloved as she was, Rachel witnessed with her own eyes how her sister's status in Jacob's home rose with each birth. She understood the significance of the names Leah gave her sons and observed how her spurned sister became a happy woman. Rachel knew that despite her beautiful face, the true disability lay not in Leah's eyes, but in her empty womb, and Rachel became a sad woman. In her distress, she sounded from the depths of her heart the miserable call of all her sisters who share the same fate. Quote, And when Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister and said to Jacob, Give me children or else I die. Genesis 31. We would have expected Jacob to comfort his beloved wife, but the opposite happened. Jacob had no patience for Rachel's tears, and he gave her a harsh and cruel answer. And Jacob's anger was aroused against Rachel, and he said, Am I in the place of God, who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb? We will never justify a man who hates his wife and answers rudely to the other one, but our task is to explain the story against the background of its times, not to judge the actions of the biblical heroes. Jacob's answer attests to the deep frustration he felt. He worked so hard to pay Rachel's bride price, only to find out that he had paid double the price for a wife who was unable to fulfill her sole duty and bear him children. For what did he work? Ironically, the very woman given to him in deception added to his honor. Thanks to Leah, he became head of a strong, established household. Shocked by her husband's outburst, Rachel realized what she had to do. Like Sarah 2 generations before her, she gave Jacob her slave woman, Bilhah. Bilhah conceived and gave birth to a son, and Rachel called him Dan. And Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son. And Rachel said, God has vindicated me, and has also heard my voice and given me a son. Therefore she called his name Dan. Dan means judge. In the context of this story, God did not vindicate Rachel, but judged her for long years of infertility and sadness. Naphtali was the second son Bilhah bore. Quote, And Bilhah, Rachel's maid, conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. And Rachel said, "With mighty wrestling I have wrestled with my sister, and I have prevailed." So she called his name Naphtali. Naphtali means wrestling or struggling. In Naphtali's name, Rachel commemorated the struggle that took place between her and Leah over their place in Jacob's house. The third son was finally Rachel's own. For this son, she had waited so many years, and Rachel called him Joseph. In Hebrew, Yosef. And God remembered Rachel and opened her womb. And she conceived and bore a son and said, "God has taken away my reproach." And she called his name Yosef, saying, "May the Lord add to me another son." Yosef has two different meanings, to add and to remove or take away. Like every barren woman of her time, Rachel considered herself a disgrace, a shameful wife who did not fulfill her duty to her husband. After Joseph was born, Rachel felt that God finally removed her disgrace. God has taken away my reproach. The other meaning of Yosef is to add to. Rachel asked, "May the Lord add to me another son." How terrible was her wish. How accursed. God did grant her request, but disastrously. Rachel conceived a second time, but during the delivery, something went wrong. In the last moments of her short, tragic life, she managed to give her second son his horrible name. Quote, Rachel went into labor and had difficulty in her childbirth. As her soul was departing, for she died, she called his name Ben-Oni, but his father called him Benjamin. Genesis 35:17-18. The word Ben means son. Oni has two contradictory meanings, power and strength, but it also death, sorrow, or mourning. From the mouth of a dying woman, the name Ben-Oni cannot mean power, but rather the second meaning, the son who brings my death. With this name that commemorates her demise, Rachel's life ended and she returned her tortured soul to her Creator. Understandably, Jacob changed Ben-Oni's name and called him Benjamin, or Benjamin. Ben means son, Yamin means right. In biblical language, the right hand points to the south. Since Benjamin was born in Israel, south of Haran, he was called son of the south, or Benjamin. The English translation of the country called Yemen is the land in the south. Let us summarize the two episodes dedicated to the story of Jacob and his two wives. On the surface, the family stories in the Bible appear to be simple and easy to understand, but nothing could be less true than that. The stories in the Bible are highly complex, both from a theological perspective that reveals a glimpse of the divine plan for the human being, as well as from a historical and legal standpoint, and of course, from a literary aspect. From a theological point of view, the most striking thing that emerges from our story is that Leah, like Sarah and Rebekah, was a chosen woman, while Rachel was an ordinary woman. Once we consider that Leah was a chosen woman, it is clear from the very beginning who is the grand winner and who is the loser. And here is the place to say that the struggle between the two sisters did not end during their lives, but hundreds of years later, in the time of Saul and David. Saul was the first king of Israel who came from the tribe of Benjamin, named after Rachel's son. But according to the divine plan, the kingship did not pass from him to his son Jonathan, but to David, who came from the tribe of Judah, named after Leah's son. The historical aspect of the story is completely different from the theological one, and it is very emotional. It is easy to identify with the rage Jacob felt when he realized that Laban had deceived him and stolen from him the long years of work that were supposed to be Rachel's bride price and married him to a woman he never intended to wed. Jacob's frustration explains his hostile attitude toward Leah during the first years of their marriage. But since Leah fulfilled her sole duty as a wife and bore him many children, Jacob gradually changed his attitude toward her. And indeed, his final request was to be buried beside her and not beside Rachel. Genesis 49:29-31. In the last two chapters, we have seen that the stories of the Bible, especially those in Genesis, are much longer than the number of words written in them, thanks to the ingenious technique in which the same number of words are used to write two different stories simultaneously, theological and historical. Another literary technique was the intensive use of words with multiple meanings that added important information to the story. As we have shown here, Rebecca, Leah, and Rachel, who were born on a thriving sheep farm, are named after milk-producing animals. The name of Jacob, who was born holding his brother's heel, indicates that he was the youngest twin. Laban, in Hebrew, means white, the color that symbolizes purity and cleanliness. Laban's name teaches us that he follows God's plan when he marries Leah first as a senior woman, even if he had to do so at the expense of Rachel's bride price. The names of the sons born to Leah and Zilpah show how from birth to birth the hated wife improved her status and became a happy and beloved woman. On the other hand, the names Rachel gave to the sons born to her indicate the defeat of the unfortunate young woman. Before we tell what we are going to talk about in the next 3 episodes, let's say a few words about Dr. Leah Ravid, who wrote and edited this podcast. Ravid is a PhD in biblical studies and an expert in the literary aspects of the Bible and an expert in the history of the biblical period. Ravid believes that in order to understand why the heroes of the Bible acted the way they did, it is necessary to understand the social and legal norms that existed in the ancient world, which do not exist in our modern world. One of the goals of our podcast is to translate puns and words with multiple meanings that play a significant role in the Bible's original language, but become meaningless when translated into English. The reason for this is that the Bible was translated literally and meticulously into English. A literal translation does not allow the translator to use the full range of meanings that the same word has in the original language. For example, the word Adam cannot be translated as ground, from which the first human was created, or as male, the gender in which he belonged. Therefore, Adam, Rebecca, Leah, and Rachel became just an ordinary name. Our podcast requires expertise in biblical history and the language in which it was written. Anyone willing to help us fund this important and unique project is invited to visit our website and contribute to us through Patreon. Anyone interested in purchasing Dr. Ravid's book, Daily Life in Biblical Times, can also do so through our website. The book, like our podcast, examines the stories of the Bible from social, legal, and other perspectives. Of course, in it you will find a translation of the dozens of puns. The book was written in a language that is easy to read and is intended for everyone. Now we will say what we will talk about in the next 3 episodes. The next 3 episodes are dedicated to the story of Judah and Tamar. This story was also written as 2 separate stories, one theological and the other historical. From the theological point of view, Tamar was a chosen woman. God chose her to stand alongside Sarah, Rebecca, and Leah. From day-to-day perspective, her story reveals the complicated legal situation of a woman who was widowed before she had children and therefore had to marry her brother-in-law and give birth to a son who would legally be considered as the firstborn son of the deceased. It resembles a kind of surrogacy in which the living brother begets a son and heir for his dead brother. Thank you so much for listening to us, and please tell friends and relatives about this special podcast.